deploying web apps, web app server, and how 19.0 is going to make that a tad bit easier for all of us. So, web app server in 19.0. I had a couple of these slides in my overview, but my overview went really fast because it went really fast. It was the first time I'd ever had to try and do a session in 30 minutes or less, and I kind of went overboard, but I'm getting better. So what's happening in web app server in 19.0? First of all, we talked about 64-bit support. Simplifies the installation and configuration. Allows both 32 and 64-bit on the same server. So if you have older versions of DataFlex and newer versions of DataFlex, as you know, you can have them installed on the same machine, and you can have your prior to 19.0 web apps that still need their 32-bitness, and then you can have your 19.0 and higher that probably only need the 64-bit side of the server. The administrator allows applications to be configured to run on other than the default website. You saw me do that quite a couple of times. Well, if you were here, you saw me do that a couple of times. If you went and thought customers were more important than me, then that's fine. Yeah. So the administrator allows you to do that now. There's a new command line interface for managing your web applications. And so it allows you to have that same control over what website is used, and it just makes life a little easier. So the 64-bit support is, again, we're talking about the server process here. DataFlex itself is still 32-bit. The compiled web apps are still 32-bit. So you say, okay, well, what good is a 64-bit server if everything is 32-bit? Well, it's actually a lot of good because A, you can not have to worry about setting that 32-bit application configuration in IIS. And B, it just, as somebody said, I think in one of the earlier things, we didn't see any real difference in speed going 64-bit, but that's where everybody wants to be, so now you can say we're 64-bit. So you've got the extra binaries located in the bin64 folder, and it uses the ISAPI handler to go, oh, you're a 32-bit thing, I'll shunt you over here. You're a 64-bit thing, I'll put you over there. And it just does it all automatically. You don't have to do, there's nothing special that you do to make it run one way or the other. You say, okay, well, what happens if I use 32-bit things in my web app? Well, if you're using them in your web app, which means maybe you're using COM or something like that, and it's compiled into your web app exe, that's still a 32-bit thing, and it's still, the web app exe is still 32-bit that's calling it, so you're fine. It's only if you're using things at like the HTML ASP level. So you're not in web app yet, you're in that layer on top of it. If you're running 64-bit, and you're using something at that level, you need to make sure you have a 64-bit version of that thing. I don't know anybody that's doing that, but I'm supposed to say it, so I said it. The fact that we're using the ISAPI controller to do this switching means that we needed IIS 7 to do it, and so it basically finally forced us to change off the old IIS 6 metabase, so we don't have to use that anymore, so you don't have to use that anymore with 19.0 and greater. The command line interface is where it gets interesting for you as trying to deploy. I'm going to get into this in more detail, but basically what you've got is, you've always had a command line interface, you just maybe didn't know it was there. There's this little thing called wincrtvdir.exe. It's a little executable that's in the bin folder. And if you knew what the magic was for that, or if you had seen me talk about the magic at any one of these things over the past few years, you would have known that that is the thing that the installer uses to set up your web apps. And there is a command line interface for it, and you can tell it to create a directory, remove a directory, register the services, do all that good stuff. We've replaced that with a new piece called dfmanagevdir.exe, and what it is really just an executable wrapper for the DLL. Internally, in the studio and in the administrator, we're talking to the DLL that's doing all this stuff, but to do a command line to it, you needed an exe wrapper, so that's what that is. And that's what the installer uses, and that's what you can use if you decide to try and automate what you're doing. So what can it do? It can say, create under website X, which is default if it's just quote, quote, this web order 19 at this location for my virtual folder. Oh, and if it already exists, don't complain about it, just do it again. Blow the old one away and put the new one in. And this sets up your IIS GUI for what you need to do. You can also tell it to just remove a website, and it's got a quiet mode. If you run this, and we'll see it, it pops up a little box that tells you either what it was successful in doing or what it couldn't do because something went wrong. And then there's a quiet mode to hide the console. And the other thing that dfmanageVDIR.exe can do is either add or remove the ISAPI manager mapping that DataFlex needs. Now, normally you'll never do that. The installation does that. So when you go and install DataFlex Web App Server, it's going to do that for you. The only reason it's up there is because it's actually the same piece that does it. So if you think something went wrong after you've installed, and you think, oh, maybe my ISAPI handler got screwed up somehow, I don't know how, but maybe, you can do that, and it'll fix it, because that's what the installer did to set it correctly in the first place. So, what are the successful ingredients? What do you need to deploy? Well, you need an installed DataFlex Web App Server. You may need an installed SQL Server if you've been paying attention and you go, God, I got to do that. So you need one of those guys. You need installed IIS properly configured. You need web application. And that web application may need, if it's going to be SQL-based, you either need a script or maybe a backup. You know, how are you going to get that database created at the deployed server? Well, you've seen that happen a couple times over the past couple days with those scripts. That's not the only way to do it. You could actually, make a nice empty database, back it up, and then use that as a restore. Some people like using backups and restores for SQL. Some people like using script. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. There's no right way to do it. The right way is that when you end up at the end of the process, the database is out there and it's set up correctly. That's the right way to do it. So you got that, and then you need the GUI. All right, I know it's a little technical term, and it's late in the afternoon, and people are sleepy after lunch, but so how do you get the GUI? What is the GUI? Well, the studio properly creates the GUI. You know that because you've seen me do it a couple of times. The administrator also properly creates the GUI. You can create GUI too. You just got to know what the GUI is. So what is the GUI? Well, the GUI is a combination of things. It's the web application name goes into making the GUI. Remember when that first time I tried to deploy on the first morning, I tried to deploy the Chinook example that the people that in class did? And so I went in and I loaded it into the studio, and the dashboard said, there's a web app mismatch here, stop, run away. And when I clicked on it, it brought it up, and there was 2 things that I needed to fix in there, and a third that was optional. I needed to fix the web app name. That's that. And the web app name is what DataFlex uses to know about who you are and what you're trying to do. And then I had to fix the virtual folder name. That's the thing that IIS needs to know about. And there's a connection between the virtual folder in IIS and what DataFlex Web App Server is trying to do. And then I need, if I'm using SQL and I'm using the new managed things, remember I've got that INI file out there, the dfconid.ini, and in there's a name that I'm using. I need to know what that managed connection name is. Because remember, it all comes down to the logical name of the managed connection. Remember, order. And order might be pointing to this database or that database, but it's order that's the GUI and the glue that ties it together. And then there's a bunch of registry settings. So, okay, how do you know what that is? Well, let's go look at what that is. And all right, so what I have here is I have a Synergy folder, and I've got some stuff. And it says, deploy me, please. So rather than trying to, have something all set up already and stuff like that, I'm just going to fly by the seat of my pants and try and figure out what we want to do here. So remember, the first thing we said we needed was a web application server. Well, I have that. I've already had the studio installed. Interlude here. The difference between what the installer does and what you're trying to do. We have 3 installations. Studio, Server, Client. Think of the installation as the thing that puts all the components in place that you may need to use. The Studio will put everything that we have, everything for development, everything for Web App Server, everything for the runtime. So if you use a Studio installation, no matter what else you need to do, as long as you have the proper reg codes, you can do everything. You can be a client, it can be a server, it can be a development environment. A server installation takes off the development stuff. It has everything you need to be a server or a client. So in the case where you've got a server that is a network server that's going to be serving your Windows application and your web application, you're going to use the Studio install because it has all the pieces it needs for both functions, and then you're going to register your client license and your server license. And then the client license can only do clients. That's all it's good for. So the installations put the pieces in place. Your licenses because they can stack, put the functionality in place for those pieces. Okay, so I already have a web app server installed because I have the Studio there. Now I might, if it was a deployment site, I would then go and talk to Fern and say, what kind of a deal can you give me? And he'll say, well, it depends if the chip finds out. But I'll get the right server licenses, and then I'll register them, and life will be fine. So I've got that first piece. The second piece was IIS. Well, I went in a long time ago, and I installed IIS, and I can tell because I can run IIS Manager. Now you say, what do I know about what's a properly configured IIS? Well, there's documentation about it, but there's also a little piece called the DataFlex Web App Check, and it'll tell you if you've got IIS installed correctly. Now, some of you have seen this, well, hopefully all of you have seen this when you run the install, and you say, wait a minute, that's got more stuff on it than when I see it in the install. That's because there's a command line parameter that you can pass to this that says, I'm installing this rev of DataFlex. I don't care about the rest of the other stuff. I don't care that it's going to tell me what the latest DataFlex revision is installed because I'm installing 19.0 or 18.2 or whatever. So that's why it's a more restricted set. But you can run this, and it'll go out and it'll check everything that it needs to check about whether your IIS is installed, and it'll tell you what you've got right and what you've got wrong. And you can see I've got IIS services 7.8 installed, that's good. I've got ASP turned on, that's good. There's a default website, I can talk to it, that's good. 32-bit applications is true on mine because this is a machine I'm still running older versions on, so I have in the default website 32-bit still turned on. If this was a brand new deployment environment that I was only using 19.0, I didn't have to turn that on. It would show that as a failure, quote unquote, but it's really not a failure. It's just telling you that it's not set, but I don't need to worry about it. I've got the ISAPI handler is already there. The URL rewrite I'm not worried about. That's if you're going to map the IP address to an actual, something, whatever. You need to have that URL rewrite installed, but I'm not doing that, so I don't care. But if I did care, I would say, click on Read More, and it would tell me what I needed to know. And then, using friendly URLs and stuff like that. Port 80 is listening. The latest DataFlex version happens to be 19.0. And it's a Studio. I've got a Studio there. And the default web application server is running because I'm already installed. Obviously, those things aren't going to be there if you're doing an install because they're not ready yet. And then there's this non-interactive heap size. It doesn't matter for most people, but if you want to know more, you can say read more about it. So I've got IIS installed. So now, what was that next piece? Oh, it was if I'm using SQL, I need the SQL Server installed. I know I have that. And now I need a script. So I've got a script here. It's called Deploy Me, Please. So just to make sure that there's nothing up my sleeve, give me a deployment name for this application. Fred it is. So I'm going to go into here. Now, keep in mind that I'm using the Management Studio, but if you're doing an automated install, you're going to be feeding, SQL Server, like everything, has the ability to consume instructions not from a human being pressing a mouse. Okay, so you'll tell SQL Server with whatever it wants to use to do that. So you might go in and generate this script with the right name in it, or maybe it was a backup and it has the right name in it, or you tell the backup, the restore. One of the nice things about a backup and restore is you do a backup as George, but then you tell it to restore as Fred, and it does that. So you don't have to go in and do this. But here, I've got my deploy me please, and I want to go in and do a replace with Fred. I do that. That's good. I execute. So if I had this script out there, I would have told SQL Server to do this, and it would have created my Fred database, and then I would have been done. So now I know that there's a database out there called Fred, and it's the one I want. And I hope, just to check, I didn't want to exit. Let me just double check something here. Go here. Oh, no, go here. Go here. Go here. Open that up. User mapping. And Fred has, because remember, when I created the script, I said, do the schema and do the data and do the users. So it knew that it was supposed to add, because I've never done Fred before. How did I know? And it's not like I paid Michael, or told him I'd buy him a beer. He's not that easily bought. He is that easily bought, but I didn't do it. But you tell the script, I want the users to go along with it, and it knew that it needed to give the NT account access to Fred. So Fred's in there, he's got access, so I know it's going to work. All right, so I've got that. So now, there was something about the, now I've got Fred in there. What if I go here and go here and open up this guy? Remember, it's Fred. It's not deploy me, please. Now, the connection ID is Chinook. That's going to stay the same. Remember, that you leave that alone. It's this guy that needs to change. So programmatically, of course, I'm going to tell it that the database I just deployed is Fred. So my automated installer would have done that for me automatically. So now I've got the database. I've got an application that knows about the database. Now what happens? Well, remember I said that the studio knows how to do the GUI and the administrator knows how to do the GUI, but we don't know how to do the GUI because we don't know what the GUI is? Well, you can use the studio or the administrator to teach you what the GUI is. So let's do the administrator. Oh, I want to do one more thing here. Just to make sure that there's nothing hiding here, I'm going to rename this guy Fred, and I'm going to rename this guy, even though I don't have to. If I open them up in the studio, I want them to be that way. So all my pieces are Fred now. You don't have to name everything the same. It's just kind of, then you don't have to guess what pieces you don't do and don't do. So if I ran the administrator, because I was there, I would do something like this. I would say, configure a new web application. It's a local application. I'm not going to spend time here trying to go over load balancing and whether it's a master or a slave or stuff like that. That's kind of another whole presentation. But it's just this is a local web application. And I need to tell it where the web app exe lives. So I will browse to C:, Synergy, Fred, Programs, web app. And I don't need any parameters for it, and I've got the log file there. I don't want to log all access to the application because that's just silly. It's fine for if you're, it's not, I shouldn't say silly, because some people want to see as people come and go in their web app. But if you have a lot of people coming and going, you can end up with really big log files. And so, or you can just also limit the log file to, let's say, 5,000. And it'll just give a first in, first out pipe of how many things get logged. But I only like to see logs of when things go wrong, because that's what I want to focus on. I don't want to sort through the 27,000 times that things went right, unless you need it. So I do that. I do want it to be process pooling. I don't have to, but I want it to be. I can set min and max processes. I can tell it to automatically reload the processes at a particular time. I can automatically reload every X amount of time. Or I can just say, no, don't reload, just run. And so this is going to set up my process pool. 10's a little high. I'll do 4 there. And I go next. And then my default, what website do I want it on? Well, I want this on the Synergy website because I spent so much time setting it up. And what do I want the virtual directory name to be? Fred. And where is my share? And my share is C:/Synergy Fred app.html. I say next. I want my application to be Fred. Everything's there. It's all good. I finish. Does not match the name found in. What happened there? There's another file. Global ASA. Remember, global ASA is the thing that kind of maps from what IIS wants to know and our web services stuff to someplace else. So it says I'm going to go out here and go to my and say Fred. And again, I would do that programmatically. Go back to this, say yes. And now you can see I have Fred, and there are 2 processes running. So that is what would have happened when I do it in the administrator. So you say, okay, well, how would I do something like that without the administrator? Well, there's 2 things. Remember I said that there is obviously the global ASA needed to be updated. The studio would have actually done that for me. Okay, it wouldn't have just complained. It would have said, oh, you're going to, when I clicked on that thing and said, okay, it would have just rewritten global ASA for me, which would have changed that one word in it. So it would have done that for me. I know what the application connection ID is and stuff like that. So now what else happened? Well, it went into IIS, and it created that guy right there. And the reason it created that guy right there is because it did that. Does this have the ability to? No, of course it doesn't. All right, so it did dfmanage vdir.exe, and it said create under the website Synergy. Now, of course, it didn't do deploy me, please. It did Fred, okay? And it said C:/Synergy Fred app.html overwrite. So I would do that in my whatever script I'm writing my installer in, and I would give it the full path name. I would tell it there, I would tell it there. And remember, I know it's Fred because I got that at the very beginning of my installation process, and then my installation process went, updated global ASA, updated this file, updated the setting in the df connection INI file. So that's what it did. And then, so it did that, but remember we said there's one more piece. So that did the marriage between IIS and DataFlex. There's one more piece, the registry settings. So you come here, and you learn what the registry settings are. If I could type, it would help. And where this all happens is HKey local machine software. Since it's a 64-bit system, it's under WOW 6432, data access worldwide, whatever rev you are. Web app server, web applications, there's Fred. These are all of the things that get set up for you automatically when you use the administrator or the studio. Remember all those questions it asked me? Well, it said disable is set to 0, because the web app, I want the web app to run. By the way, if you have the question, how do I stop and start a web app? That guy. You set him to 1, no matter how many processes are in your pool, it'll kill them all off. Then you do whatever you need to do. Then you set that back to 0, and it'll start them all back up again. So that's what disable does. Log access. I told it I didn't want to log all access. If I had left that checked, it would be 1. The log file, where does it live? The max logs entries, I set to 5,000. The max pool, 4. The min pool, 2. The operation mode, remember I said this is just a local web app. Okay? No program parameters. Where does the web app.exe is? How often should I purge the pool? And it's all right there. So again, your installation process will set those the way you want them set. And now you know how to install everything manually if you can't use either the studio or the administrator. You have global ASA, you have the connection pool ID, you have the DF manage vdir to set the IIS connection, and you have those registry entries. And you're done. Thank you.